Fab. Right, we're in the last session of the day. I hope everyone's had a brilliant conference. I caught a bit of Jeff Crocker at the end of the last session, just giving a brilliant summary of where the debate is. I hope that's an indication of how good the rest of the day has been. And thanks to the IPR, to the Bristol Ideas people, and to Jeff and everyone at the UBI.org team. Last session. Is it time for universal basic income? And is UBI the right response to future needs? That's what we're going to be addressing in this last session. And if it isn't right for future needs, then we've got a bit of a problem. But, I think it is. I'm Neal Lawson. I'm from Compass, which is a pressure group for a good society, which is focused on not much policy, but we do talk a lot about basic income. And we do that because it opens up the whole question of what the good society and the good life is, and tips everything onto the table. And the other thing the reason why we like UBI is because it isn't about the humiliation of the people, of the most vulnerable people in our society. And anything that does that is a good thing by Compass. And so we've been working with Jeff at UBI, we've been working with the people at Bath, and we've also got our own basic income conversation to begin to develop this in communities, in sectors and in different places. So is basic income the right response to future needs? To help us answer that question, we've got four brilliant, amazing speakers who I know well and love to death. The first one is Paul Mason, who you'll all know is a journalist, writer, filmmaker, activist, etc., whose most recent book I've read and talked to Paul about, How to Stop Fascism, History, Ideology, Resistance. And, if we had basic income, I think we might, be on the route to creating some of the social and economic and cultural foundations to stop fascism. So Paul will be going first. He'll be followed by, in the order I've got here, and I don't think it matters too much, Clare McNeil, who is Associate Director of Work and Wealth and the Welfare State at the IPPR, brilliant institution, which is coming out with so much progressive stuff. So great to have you here, Clare, and look forward to what you've got to say. We've got Kate Soper, who I've known for years and is a brilliant academic who makes us think about, again, what the good society and the good life is with her alternative views of what hedonism is. And if we want a basic income, then I think we've got to shift to a different conversation about what the good life and the good society is. And we've also got the wonderful Andrew Fisher, who was part of the team leading the Labour Party between 2015 and 2019, helped write some great manifestos, which did contain UBI and did some great work to push that debate, and is now kind of writing in the Guardian, etc., etc. So let's take you in that order: Paul, Clare, Kate, and Andrew. So Paul, over to you first. Is UBI going to meet our future needs?
Well, thank you for that, Neil. And I'm sorry I didn't catch quite a lot of the conference. It sounds like it's been brilliant. So for me, there are three things we probably have to do. One we definitely have to do in the 21st century. There definitely is zero net carbon and the total modal changes that go alongside that to completely decarbonize the economy. That is mandatory, and I think it comes in a list, of priorities before UBI. The other is mandatory. We have to fight for social justice and redistribution. And there are, in my PQ article about post-capitalism, I point out that you could, if you wanted to, completely ignore the kind of post-capitalist UBI agenda and try and do social justice and redistribution as Labour is trying to do it, and many social democratic parties are trying to do it through work, through a decarbonised work economy. But the reason I'm pessimistic about being able to do that is I just think, first of all, capitalism has changed, and there are now, instead of one channel of extraction of surplus value, i.e. work, as existed for the 250 years of industrial capitalism, there are now many channels through which capitalists take value out of our lives. One is work, one is rent, one is financial extraction, financial exploitation, and another one is digital extraction. Consumption in its own way you could argue as well. Now, given that, if you want a social justice program, then if like Rachel Reeves or even Boris Johnson, you're trying to do it through redistribution through higher wages and work, you're pushing against the headwind that digital technology is creating. Even though we've got an artificially created labour shortage in the United Kingdom, I think globally it is provable in the advanced economies that digital technology pushes towards a situation where mass decisive automation becomes possible if we want it to happen. And I am somebody who wants it to happen. I think we need to move beyond utopias based on work because capitalism isn't going to hang around in a kind of stable state as we try and do the climate imperative and the social justice imperative. It is, I think, catastrophically failing to mutate and develop in response to the rapidly changing potential of information technology. As I argue in the book, I just think both spontaneously and through the projects that we pursue, we could eradicate work, we could eradicate necessary labour time, or certainly dramatically reduce it. I don't think that's a totally spontaneous program and a process, but it's something that is the premise from which I would work. Now, in other words, in the 21st century, we're going to have to de-link work from wages. We're going to have to find new ways of people surviving that aren't dependent on compulsory work in the marketplace. Personally, I think the easiest part of the UBI agenda to graft on to the traditional social democratic agenda is universal basic services, because Jonathan Portes and the IPPR report on this, I think, proved fairly conclusively you get more bang for your buck. Since bucks are still hanging around at the beginning of a transition process, we have to be prepared to do that. In the longer term, I don't see UBI as an alternative welfare system, an alternative social justice system. I see it as a transitional measure to move from a situation where everybody has to do compulsory work to a situation where nobody has to do much compulsory work at all. And so for me, UBI is temporary. It's not a permanent solution, but it'll take us the best part of a generation to achieve it. That's where UBI sits for me. It doesn't sit at the kind of front end of a social justice and redistribution program. It sits somewhere like Soviet planning used to sit in the 20th century for people who wanted to do transitions through Soviet-style planning.
And I think it would, if we hear from Clare next, I mean, we can get into this in the questions, Clare, but, we heard at the Labour Party conference last week, the centrality of work, that is, the contribution society. This is running completely counter to, it seems to me, to the universalism of UBI. But anyway, so is it something that's going to meet, help us meet our future needs? Clare, over to you.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks to the organisers. It's fantastic to be joining this panel. So 3 main reflections from me. Firstly, I think we'd all agree that the focus on UBI reveals the weaknesses of the welfare state within many advanced countries such as the UK. It's really interesting, I think, that support for UBI is stronger in countries where people have the perception that the welfare state is broken and that labour markets are not functioning properly. So around 50% of people in this country support the introduction of a UBI, at least in principle. And we also see that in Eastern European countries, post-socialist countries. Support is weaker, though, in countries that do have a comprehensive, more generous social security system, like in Germany, Switzerland, and of course in Scandinavia. So I think the swell of support for a UBI is a response to many things, but it is definitely a response to our residualised welfare system and the rise in insecure and precarious employment, as Paul's just talked about. Clearly, that is a product of labour market reforms, which began in this country in the 80s and saw employment protections reduced, and the privatisation of key aspects of the welfare system. And I think we saw this very clearly in the pandemic with the priority that was given to forms of financial support that underpinned the market. You know, for example, to businesses, workers and homeowners, in contrast to renters, low-income families and the unemployed. So I think one of the most persuasive arguments for a UBI is the need to be resilient and to move swiftly in the face of shocks. Having some kind of pre-existing structure in place could help avoid the sharp distinction that we saw, for example, between those who are in work and were supported by the furlough scheme and those who were out of work, relying on universal credit. Another really persuasive argument is the impact of technological change on the labour market, which Paul has just mentioned today, and I'm sure was much discussed today. Particularly for younger people, there's a need to consider the role of non-work forms of income, such as UBI, in this context. But for me, just lastly, I think the question the UBI debate really poses for me is how universal should our welfare state be, and how generous should our social security system be? And we would argue that we need more universalism and less means testing, but there are a number of ways of achieving that. We've argued for a minimum income guarantee, so a universal guarantee delivered through a targeted payment which sets a minimum acceptable standard of living, which is linked to the minimum income standard, which is a measure of what people need to secure a decent standard of living. It's not a universal basic income, but importantly, it does carry a far lower financial burden, because as well as investing in social security to really address future needs, to come to the question that we've been posed, and we do need to invest more in collective risk pooling. So investing in public services, whether that's in relation to social care, childcare, or training and skills. So fundamentally, yes to more universality in our welfare system and investment in public services, and yes to considering the role of non-work forms of income alongside this. But crucially, this needs to be achieved in ways which can be publicly financed and which can secure popular consent.
Follow up, and I mean, do you think the Labour Party is getting closer to that universalism and generosity, or not?
I think, to be honest, it's too early to tell. I think that there's certainly receptiveness to arguments for that, and there's been encouraging signs when it comes to these like a minimum guarantee, which are a bit more incrementalist. But yeah, I think it's probably too early to tell at this point.
Okay, bit like the French Revolution. Okay, Kate, over to you. I really like this kind of like big picture from Paul, getting more focused on the kind of policy area. Over to you from Claire. Now over to you, Kate. Take us out big again in terms of what does this mean for the kind of lives we want to live?
Okay, Neil, thanks for that, and to the organisers for allowing me to have an opportunity to talk about this. Is UBI the way to provide for future needs? Well, I guess how we answer will depend in part on how we construe future needs, and indeed on whether we're talking about needs in the most basic sense, or about the conditions of future flourishing and gratification of a more complex kind. My own view, and it coincides much of the science now on climate change, is that there can be no sustainable global order without greater equality, both between and within nations, and that this will require radical social economic changes, especially in affluent societies, including, importantly, a reduction in work, and hence the provision of some kind of citizens' income, or UBI. Less work and income is likely to be available anyway because of automation. But we also, I think, have to rein in productivity. We begin to think in terms of a transition to a post-growth economy and way of living, which in turn will demand a kind of cultural revolution in our thinking about the real nature of prosperity. What is it that we want to foster in the name of living well? In this sense, I see ecological crisis as an opportunity to move beyond the work-centered understanding of identity purpose and self-fulfillment to one that revolves around more self-chosen ways of spending time and energy. I follow Andre Gortz, a seminal thinker in this area, in recognizing that we can't and won't want, I think, to eliminate work altogether. But we do need to move beyond the culture of the work ethic, with its stigmatizing of the unemployed and its lingering sense that only those in work are deserving of a living wage. As Gort himself put it, we need to, I quote, wrest life away from the commercial imaginary and its total employment model. We need to, I believe, to think of UBI funding as allowing for slower and more hybrid ways of working. The return maybe of artisanal methods could coexist with state-of-the-art green technologies. They are also, I think, compatible with communally owned enterprises and cooperatives in which labour is no longer subject to the imperative of maximising profit by reducing labour time. This more complex vision of the work-life balance should be reclaimed as an integral component of an avant-garde political imaginary, rather than dismissed as folk politics stuck in pre-modern social relations. But I do recognise that UBI funding is a site of considerable tensions regarding its purpose and impact, where the right defends it as increasing productivity through releasing time for entrepreneurial creativity and see it as an alternative to welfare funding. The moderate left view it as a supplement to welfare and as lessening inequalities. And those, like myself, more aligned with the degrowth movement, advocate it as encouraging a shift from GDP measures of well-being and from viewing efficiency as time saved in production rather than as time spent on life-enhancing activities. And just as there's a right-wing dismissal of UBI as money for doing nothing, so there are fears on the left that it would simply lead to more shopping, thus doing little to reduce environmental damage. And there are similar divisions, of course, about its funding. If that's done by eco-taxes, then this could lock UBI into eco-damaging forms of production. If it's by taxing wealth, it makes provision dependent on maintaining inequality. So I think I share these reservations on funding and also the concerns that UBI in affluent societies may do little to adjust global inequalities or reduce the transfer of natural resources from richer to poorer zones, like looking at issues on a more global scale. So I suppose my view is that overall, UBI can only work within a radically altered economy and value system, to which, of course, I suspect many will just say, dream on.
Thanks, Kate. Everything starts with a dream, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. I don't know any idea that's ever started without, first being a dream and first being impossible. And the fine line between what's impossible one day and possible the next is, as we've seen over the furlough and this government giving out huge wads of money and finding the magic money tree, et cetera, et cetera. So, Andrew, maybe bring us slightly back down to earth again as we kind of, move in and out. Where do you see the debate, politically around, progressives and the left, or not just the left, shaping up to these future demands?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll confess. I'll start with a confession. I'm a bit of a UBI skeptic, but in the genuine sense of that word, skeptic. I'm not anti. I'm skeptical. I do think there's a better alternative, but before I kind of come on to that, I want to look at the kind of areas of agreement because I like to build consensus. I think there's a kind of agreement at the moment that Social Security doesn't actually do what it says on the tin and provide social security. We need to increase the level of benefits. We need a less punitive, more humane system with less stigma attached. And I think we need more universality to do that. Those two things combined also provide people with more autonomy. They empower people rather than degrade them. And I think the last Secretary of State with responsibility for Social Security to actually do any of that was Barbara Castle, who coincidentally was born on this day. Every other minister since, I think, has either attacked people on Social Security or attacked the levels of Social Security themselves, or more likely done both. So perhaps to use the Prime Minister's phrase, we need to build back Barbara, perhaps, in a way. Look, Labour Party conference, I think, was quite underwhelming on a lot of levels this year. But one of the highlights for me was actually on social security and Johnny Reynolds' speech, which got virtually no media coverage. But I'm just going to quote a line from it because I actually think it was pretty good. He said, "We want a system that supports people to live the lives they want, not one that tries to catch people out and take away their support." And I think for a lot of people that will resonate, because anybody who's interacted with the social security system over the last 10 years knows that is exactly what it is. I remember interviewing some PCS members, the trade union that represents workers in the DWP who worked in job centres. And they said, "I came into this job to help people. Now I feel like I'm made to trip them up." And that, I think, is a sad reflection. That was about 2013, 14, so the height of kind of Osborne's austerity. But not much has changed since, obviously. Johnny Reynolds actually is somebody who's open-minded to UBI, but I don't think it will become Labour policy. It's worth noting, as I think you mentioned at the beginning, Neil, that there was the demand for a pilot on UBI in the last Labour manifesto. And in fact, the Welsh Labour government under Mark Drakeford is committed to setting up a pilot scheme in Wales at the moment. But historically, UBI has been backed by the right. Milton Friedman backed it, for example. I mean, I don't think that's a clinching counter-argument, by the way. But it is worth reflecting, I think, why people like Milton Friedman backed it in the first place. And indeed, the Adam Smith Institute in the UK backs it too. Not as a liberating thing for individuals, but basically as market support, a cash payment for citizens to go and create markets in healthcare and education and to abolish state provision. That's what they want. Now, of course, there is the other side of that, which is a kind of libertarian left position on UBI, which was put forward, for example, by the Green Party in the 2015 election. They called for a citizen's income. Now, that was pitched at £72 a week, which, with a total cost of £280 billion, which is about double the social security budget at the moment, more or less. And that included converting all current social security payments into that UBI, that citizen's income, which is a problem because that's a lower benefit rate than many disabled people with severe disabilities or extra support needs get at the moment. It doesn't account for housing payments and other things like that. And it's only a very minimal increase even for people on job seekers allowance or on carers allowance. So it's not the kind of transformational level it would need. So universalism, yes, but it has to be needs-based too. And I think we sometimes get into a conflict between universalism being targeted and universalism versus being means tested. And I think we have to separate that out. I mean, there are experiments, and I think I am sympathetic to, in times of crises, there being this kind of system in place. I mean, you look across to the US, a similar related scheme, Biden's COVID relief bill, kind of the proposal originally for $1,400 in a check to every person in the US who earns less than $75,000 a year. It's kind of a stimulus package rather than a universal basic income. It's a one-off, it's not permanent. And I think there is a case for those sort of one-off programs. They're kind of classic Keynesian demand management in a way. Mark Drakeford's pilot in Wales, which I mentioned at the beginning, at the moment we haven't seen the full details of it, but what's being discussed is a pilot aimed at care leavers, who are perhaps one of the most excluded groups in society, to try and help them in particular. I mean, Mark Drakeford described it as a sort of asset-based welfare type experiment using some of the ideas from UBI. So we'll actually see how close it is to UBI when we learn more, but it's not necessarily going to be UBI. And of course, the Welsh government doesn't have any autonomy over social security budgets. It's having to find the money for this pilot out of other budgets. The worry, I think, as well, for people who are genuinely interested in looking at this is over what time frame that will be in order to judge its merits or demerits. But we've seen pilots in other countries, in other parts of the world, but no full implementation. And I think that is because it's not the most effective or efficient at achieving the desired outcomes. Now, just briefly, some would argue, and I think Paul and to an extent Kate did as well, that the disruption of technology, of climate change, etc., means we will come to need UBI in the future. That what we understand as crisis now will effectively become the norm tomorrow, and we will, therefore, UBI's time will come. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think I'm probably in the same position that Kate Bell was, who spoke earlier in the session today, who said, technology creates jobs just as much as it destroys them. And I think that's historically been true. Perhaps that's wrong, and this time it will be different, but I'm not wholly convinced. So I did say I'll just very quickly, if I can, Neil, still got time to sketch out a very 1 minute kind of alternative. I think it's based on some of the things that Claire said, which is a minimum income guarantee based at a minimum income standard, which is something the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has put together for many years, and a jobs guarantee or jobs and training guarantee, so that rather than a universal cash wage, which is effectively what UBI represents, what we need is a kind of a more social wage that enables people to train and get on, because there are so many barriers for people to do that, both price and supply of training in this country. I think if you look at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation minimum income standard, it's currently £227 a week for a single person. Now that might sound like a lot when you consider that as of today, the standard allowance in universal credit is going down to about £74 a week. But if you look at, say, Ireland or Germany, they have far higher levels. I mean, the main unemployment benefit rate in Ireland is £183 a week, absolutely worlds apart from what we're used to here. And I think there are other things that need to go alongside that as well that we could talk about, whether that's rent controls, the building of council housing, strengthened trade union rights, universal free childcare. All of those things, to me, fit with a better model that more effectively tackles the issues I think we need to address.
Okay, super helpful, Andrew. And I think, as ever with these conversations, there's a journey to be had, and I think all of you have expressed an interest in universalism and greater generosity, and I think different people are on different places on that journey. And I think it's one of the questions is how do we all continue that and test this out? And if we no one knows exactly what the answer to a post-beverage welfare system is, but I think there's lots of commonality that's been expressed, and lots of underlying value sentiment which gives us something to build on, even if we end up in different policy positions. We'll come on to some of the questions in the chat in a minute. But let's just do a quick, go back in the same way. I mean, Paul, it seems to me that this question of our relationship to work and to labour seem to be absolutely, central about what side of the fence you're on in terms of the dignity, centrality of labour. And Starmer made a big pitch on that, following on from the kind of Cruddas, dignity of labour, kind of book. I mean, do you think, if we are to move to that more universal, whether it's UBI, minimum income guarantee, it's going to require a change of government, and that is, at the very least, is going to require Labour-led government. Do you think that Labour's, going to move away from being Labour?
Not in the short term. It's moved slightly more back towards being Labour because it's moved towards the foundational economy approach under Rachel Reeves. But what I'd like to come back on is the I think the Labour's fundamental problem, social democracy's fundamental problem, is it's working without a theory of exploitation. It has no theory of how capital gets bigger and why we've got the lowest wage share for a century. If you have a theory, and my theory may be wrong, but my theory is that capital has moved on from simply extracting value in the production process. It is, of course, value is extracted in the production process. There's a huge financialized extraction process alongside it, where individual people are servicing credit cards, consumer debt, student loans, auto loans, valorizing capital directly. They are also directly valorizing the top 10 monopolies in the world. 8 out of 10 are tech monopolies, and they're being valorized by people's behavior and the data that emanates from it. Now, if that's your theory of exploitation, what you then have to say is, if you want to make inroads into capital, you can't only do it through work, through changing the terms of exploitation, good though it is to change the terms of exploitation. So how does that devolve into the concrete? It devolves into the concrete by saying, what would empower a person throughout their life entering the workforce now is not simply if they had a trade union able to bargain for them and raise the wage share and suppress the profit share via work. It would also be that they were able to survive and negotiate the power structures created by finance, by consumption, by prosumption, by rent-seeking business models, and above all by the tech monopolies. If they had greater autonomy over an income that wasn't derived primarily from any of these sources, but indeed was a straightforward, socially negotiated form of redistribution. Now, that on its own it just begins the argument, but it's why I think that I will certainly say, as long as work exists, it needs to have dignity. We need to fight for dignity in it. But the reason why so much undignified work exists is because to capital, that work is not primarily valorizing. It's there. I would say, to put it crudely, the reason capital needs lots of people to be baristas or hand car washers or many other of the things that David Graeber sort of labeled bullshit jobs is so they can have a credit card and a mobile phone. If they have a credit and a card and a mobile phone, they can be multiply extracted. The work is not the main thing. So we're now in a societal level negotiation with capital or battle with capital, and labourism just is mono-focused on the workplace, or is even more mono-focused on the workplace as the site of redistribution. And that's where I think we need to move beyond it.
And Claire, do you buy into that argument?
Yeah, I do. And I think to some extent it is being recognised. I think there is a move to take very seriously the need to think about non-work forms of income. And, a UBI is one of those shared wealth funds, something IPPR proposed in its Economic Justice Commission, a sort of universal inheritance payment for young people. Lifelong learning funding is akin to that. There are other forms of sort of non-work support. So I think it's definitely being recognised and taken seriously. And we obviously need to think about how we're going to fund these forms of support. There are a wide variety of options, but that's kind of where the debate gets to, I think. And
Kate, in the Reinhard in the questions asked, do you think that human rights to live in dignity has practical implications? Do you see something like a citizen's income as being part of a human right to live in dignity?
Yes, I do. I think. I think that I agree with what Paul is saying about the need for a certain kind of autonomy, in a way, of the forms of work and dependency that have been created to date through the capitalist economy and are now sort of dominating all the possible areas of our life and consumption. And I think that UBI, funded independently, as it were, of that systemic structure, would be very important to restoring the possibility of moving, of seeing our identity, our purpose in life, our sense of prosperity, and of what we really think is important, why we're producing all this wealth and so on. Rethinking some of that and being allowed to actually function on more intrinsically valuable goods than simply money making and consumerist forms of consumption. And I think it's only through the provision of that kind of income that we kind of open up a space for rethinking the purposes of our economy, moving away. At the moment, it seems to me both the mainstream parties are still really arguing about means towards a common set of ends, GDP growth, full employment, or as much employment as possible, welfare in forms that are still dependent on work and so on. And what we need, I think, now is to start thinking more about the ends. What are the purposes of all this activity? And that becomes very important for the kind of reason that I think Reinhard Huss is also talking about here, namely that I do believe it's not possible to continue with a growth economy. We need to actually reduce production, and that's why I think even one can't put one's reliance on endless technology producing work, because I think in the last analysis we need to be able to move, not immediately, not tomorrow, but after, we need to think of a transition to a post to a way in which we're no longer producing and consuming so much. And that's essential, I think, to ecological well-being ultimately.
Yeah, and I was looking at the contribution society, and I was thinking, contribute what? I mean, that the overriding thing seemed to mean work, but why not care, love, compassion, a whole load of things that don't actually destroy the environment? Andrew, I mean, picking up on the gauntlet that Paul threw down. I mean, what do you think are the political implications of that exploitation via finance and via data? Because we know how to organise politically in the workplace. So if you want something to answer that, that problem, and give people more autonomy, does that mean we have to think about how to organise to get that in those data financial places? And we're not very good at that, are we?
No, we're not. And I think it opens up big questions about ownership, frankly. And I think that's something that, the political consensus at the moment currently isn't that keen to tackle, as I think we saw just last week. And that's a real problem, because you're not going to get these kind of, whether it's the kind of shared wealth fund, whether it's the sort of employee ownership funds that we proposed in the last manifesto. It's those things you have to tackle, the ownership of these big power bases within society, whether you want to call those work related or divorce them from that. And I agree, the financialized economy is increasingly divorced from work. I agree with Paul on that. So how you tackle that has to be through ownership. We had a huge, I think, opportunity after the banking crash to really tackle that with the financial sector, and we lost it. We've missed that opportunity. Climate change, I think, provides another opportunity. And I think in terms of how we change how our economy is powered, how our lives are powered, again, is a huge opportunity to tackle those questions of ownership. And if you look at what Norway did with its North Sea oil and compare it with what we did with our North Sea oil, another one of those conjunctures where we missed an opportunity in the UK, they did create a sovereign wealth fund, which has proved very beneficial for the Norwegian economy. And I think those sort of questions have to be wrestled with. But they do raise big fundamental questions that politicians, I think, find very difficult to take on and don't have the confidence to take on, or not very many of the mainstream politicians at the moment do. So in a sense, I look at it from quite a pragmatic position. It's like, theoretically, yes, but practically how? And I think that's the big question that isn't being answered. And that's why, we are in this state, I think, economically and politically, a kind of paralysis since the banking crash in the UK. We haven't had a solution to that. I mean, you can argue, Corbynism, McDonaldism, that the kind of socialist term within the Labour Party was an attempt to answer some of that. But we seem to be retreating from that again. And I think that's what worries me, I think, the most.
And Claire, back to you. I mean, we've got climate, tech, precariousness, care, etc., etc. I mean, you're at the, thankfully, you're at the kind of practical end of trying to devise policy for for some kind of change. Let's be honest, some kind of change government. I mean, do you think, how do we get them into a place that's kind of politically feasible, electable, but then desirable in the sense of opening up this space to address all of these huge crises and challenges that are coming down, the track? Oh, that's a really tough question, but I think we need both desirable and feasible in order to get us on the journey. Do you think, is that your minimum income guarantee? Is that going to start that process?
I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, I think, we need to, the discussions about taxation to an extent, isn't it? Who do tax, how, and what are the implications there? And that's very difficult for any political party to do. We clearly tax a lot less than other European countries, and that's why our public spending is lower. More universality in public services would arguably help achieve more consent, so more kind of buy-in to the welfare system. But look, it's incredibly difficult. We've got political coalitions that are entrenched. There's much of the welfare spending currently, it goes on older people, younger people, working families, all of those sorts of the challenges around childcare, for example, it's very difficult to get significant spending in those areas for any political party. So yeah, I think it's very tied up. It's not just about policy challenges, but they're tied up with these political coalitions that are very entrenched when it comes to the welfare state, and reform is very difficult in that context.
And Paul, going back to we're talking about kind of external economic and environmental and social challenges. But going back to your recent work, there is a political challenge here as well. If we don't create the systems of security and freedom, it's not as if things can't get worse politically, unless we put in place the foundations to give people full and fulfilling lives.
Yes, but I don't think UBI or even UBS are the key the weapons we're going to use to placate and palliate the far right and right wing populism. Indeed, there is an argument. If you look at the way the Finns have pitched and done their UBI, there's the countries that end up with a UBI first are going to hit very hard the argument over who gets it, in the sense of where are the borders drawn inside Labour. In fact, what I sense as being part of the backlash against universalism is that the more universalism to do, the greater you have to define the borders, or you have to make things contributory. That's why Johnny Reynolds, indeed, in his the House magazine interview, caused a furore for suggesting we might have to go towards contributory benefits. So I think, however, for me, the attraction, or the sort of the thin end of the wedge I want to begin with is this: it's the concrete offer. If you could have all city level transport for free, not cheap, for free, long distance transport you pay per mile, average per mile, free transport, free healthcare, really free, in the sense of mental health, in the sense of physiotherapy. If you could have transport, health, education to degree level, and then housing, a right to housing, how much wages would you need? That's the issue. What would be the spur to accumulate and consume and destroy the planet's wealth? And I think that's the kind of new Fabianism I would like to inject into the left of it having enough to live on. What the other thing is, if you had that plus I would accept even a livable benefit system. So not a UBI, a really universal and non-penalized benefit system. How many diseases of poverty would you eradicate if it was absolutely clear that in this society you can never starve, your children will never go hungry? How many people's mental health and physical health would immediately rebound? So I think those are the low-hanging fruit of a kind of new beverage, and it's way short of UBI. That UBS itself delivers quite a lot of the short-term, thin end of the wedge benefits.
So we've got about kind of 8 minutes left or something before we wrap the session and we hand over to the wonderful Nick Pearce to close the conference down. Let's go round everyone again, and maybe start with you, Kate. I think the proposition just given by Paul was fantastic. It's kind of desirable and probably feasible, but it goes back to your point that we have to turn the conveyor belt off. The view that the good society is a treadmill isn't Galbraith's view is one that we have to blow apart, because enough's never enough, is it? So how do bring us back to how do we stop that kind of treadmill society, whereas enough is never enough, and UBI or universal basic services or whatever will never meet the demands because we're always being told we need more?
Well, as Claire and others pointed out, I think it's extremely difficult. However, I think if we don't find some means of rethinking both the supposed inevitability of the growth economy and the idea that we constantly can command more in the way of consumption and ever higher living standards as defined currently in consumerist ways, then I think we are heading for ecological barbarism eventually. I mean, I think that the sort of what Paul has kind of outlined as a less than UBI, but provision of a much more seriously social democratic kind of welfare system would be a great beginning to allow people to feel more security, to have more time and opportunity, I think, to participate politically, to develop a more Republican side after decades in which we've just been treated as basically consumers rather than citizens, and that this could be the beginnings of some kind of cultural revolution in our thinking about what I would call the politics of prosperity. I mean, I think there are real anxieties now about where climate change and environmental degradation are taking us, not tomorrow, but in the next 100 years. I think there's huge anxieties about the gaping abyss between the wealthy and the poorest, both nationally and internationally. And I think young people are really seriously concerned about the future in some of the most fundamental ways. Like, do we have children? I mean, how are we going to kind of survive in the next? How are they going to survive? I mean, this is now coming home for our children and their children. These things together, I think, could fuel more of a mandate of some kind for much more radical economic change than we've hitherto seen as possible within our society. But it would need a political formation, obviously, of some kind to represent that and to be able to kind of respond to an electoral mandate of that kind. But maybe that's too optimistic. What I would say on a slightly to kind of back that kind of optimism in a way is that people are now talking about degrowth. There is a degrowth movement campaigning. There is a lot going on in the academy around the formation of a degrowth strategy, ultimately, of how to transition to it and so on. And I know that's come up in the last 5 years, I would say, like UBI has almost. I mean, so ideas that were regarded as completely batty, 5 years ago, are now actually being much more seriously thought about.
Yeah, it's definitely gone from the margins to the mainstream. Claire, what's the one thing that you think is going to drive, whether it's universal basic income or minimum income guarantee, what's the one thing that's going to drive this onto the agenda of the two main parties, you think?
Well, I think it would be really easy on a day like today when we're far away from the sort of living income that Paul described, the £20 cut to universal credit, which is deeply grim. But I think there are reasons for optimism. One of the comments was about the child tax credit enhancement in the US, and that's achieved kind of widespread political support. That is a consequence of the pandemic. There is a moment that's been opened up, but by the pandemic, it is a moment that could pass quite quickly. But I think certainly as Kate says, more change seems possible than may have done 5 years ago.
Political force and what Kate was saying about opening up new political forces, and in the questions people have been asking about, should we have electoral reform in order to allow the space for these kinds of interests to be better represented? Is that the question really about how we develop the forces and forms of representation to put these kind of issues on the table?
So is that to Claire or to me?
Sorry, that was to you, Andrew.
Oh, right, okay. Sorry, I thought you were on mute at the beginning there, so I might have missed it. I think that is part of it. I think the other thing that's going to be cause political reform in this country is the generation below me. I'm 42 years old nearly in next month, and the generation below me are going to force this because they are not getting the rewards that they were promised. They're not getting improved living standards. They're not getting better paid jobs. They're not going to be able to afford housing, especially if they live in a city or want to. So those things are going to change. That demographic is going to grow up without the advantages, a good pension. Nobody younger than me is going to be in a defined benefit pension scheme virtually. They're not going to own their own home by the time they're 35 and have the mortgage paid off, before they get to retirement age. Those things aren't going to happen. And I think those sort of things are going to force different questions onto the agenda. If we are then hit by different shocks, and they seem to be occurring more rapidly, whether that's the financial crisis, whether it's driven by climate change and ecological change, whether it's COVID and pandemics or Brexit at the moment, to an extent, those things are going to shape people's political consciousness. And I think you will get the demand for more dramatic political change. And I think one of the things that gives me optimism, although obviously, the last 5 years weren't entirely bountiful in their rewards politically for the Labour Party, I do think the kind of material basis of why that shift in the Labour Party happened is still fundamentally there, and at some point has got to be wrestled with. That cannot be avoided forever. And I think, political reform does need to happen for all kinds of reasons. I'm in favour of PR. I'm a bit of a convert to that now. I used to be very much first past the post, but I do think, that does work. And I probably, in this discussion for another day, but probably favour the AMS route that works fairly well in Scotland and Wales. So you keep the constituency link as well. But I think the real question is, the system just doesn't work at the moment, and the people it works least for are the people who are kind of under 40. And 10 years, 20 years down the line, they're going to form a political majority, and that will shift things fundamentally. And how dramatically that changes basically is dependent on how politicians react today in moving us in that direction, but it's inevitable.
Paul, over to you for a last word on, what are going to be the key drivers that are going to force, as I say, whether it's universal basic income, minimum income guarantee, universal basic services, the same kind of thing. What's going to really push this onto, a reluctant political elite?
Well, for me, it's, Weber said about the origins of capitalism, it wasn't about the emergence of new property relations, it was about the emergence of a new attitude towards money. He said a few young men who inherited money started to think about what they were going to do with it in a different way than the traditional landed aristocracy. And I think that generation that we've just heard about there from Andrew is beginning already to think about the planet as the priority, and their own well-being. Think about their obsession with mental health, with sexual violence and stuff like this. That's now really important to them. And I think that if you begin from the human being, if you begin from the planet and the human being, you begin to think in a new way about society. It is that leads you to then reprioritize and it's one of the things that unfortunately is why young people just don't join and collectively struggle within trade unions. They're thinking in terms of units of the individual and the planet, and that is kind of an unfortunate thing for collectivist era people like me. But I do think it's what's going to drive their radicalism in demands for solutions. And if you, for example, I would say the popularity of zero cost university education. I don't just mean paying the fees. I mean paying everything, grants, fees, everything, is something that people can see has a society-wide benefit, and it immediately benefits them. That's, we can only construct social democratic projects out of the actual material interests of the exploited, and I think that's what gives me hope long term, that when that generation matures, they will see the sense of it. But of course, the elephant in the room in this entire discussion, which we haven't concretized in this session, is how much it's going to cost and who you're going to raise it from. I see no alternative to a massive tax raise from both the wealth and incomes of the rich, and a major redistributive program.
Okay, fantastic. And what's really interesting for me is the fact that this debate is being really crystallised, not in Westminster, not in Whitehall, but in Wales, in Scotland, Andy Burnham, in Manchester, in the UBI labs, in different sectors like air. That's where the real conversation and debate is taking place. And I think to move to something as big and transformative as a citizen's income, as basic income, is going to require new forms of political struggle. And it won't be done by the old forms, I think. And so I think that's what's going to make it really interesting. Paul Mason, Andrew Fisher, Clare McNeil, Kate Soper, you've been brilliant. That was a really big conversation, and I think we just about held it together well. I think we're going over to, thanks for everyone in the audience for your questions and the comments. I think we're going to go over to Nick Pearce now, who's going to make a comment on just the end of the day to wrap things up. And thank you for everyone's participation in that, particularly the panel. Over to you, Nick, who I think is coming in. Lovely to see you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Neil. You're always a great chair of these discussions, and a really rich one again to finish our day with. Thank you very much to all of the participants there in that panel: Paul Mason, Clare McNeil, Kate Soper, and Andrew Fisher. A very brilliant conversation, and I think it shows that one of the things about basic income is that it is a frame, if you like, through which you can debate a lot of fundamental questions for humanity, our relationship to technology and artificial intelligence and automation, our relationship to nature and the challenges of climate change and the transition to net zero, our relationship to work and labour and our definition through labour or through a lack of labour, what it means for us. And of course, these very, very important questions about fiscal and monetary policy, the purposes and politics of both fiscal and monetary policy, the relationship between public services, basic services and basic income. All of these issues are ones that you can debate through thinking about basic income. And that's one of the values of a conference of the kind we've had today. And it's been an excellent second conference for us. I hope all of you watching it have enjoyed it, taken as much from it as I've done. Each time we do these conferences, there are more issues that have risen, there's more experience. And of course, there are new experiments, new pilot schemes being devised, new political developments for us to reflect on as well. As Neil mentioned at the end there, new developments in Wales, in Scotland, as well as other countries in Europe. So not only do we have some of these deeper, if you like, philosophical questions, some of the practical questions of public policy, but also some politics and real world practical experimentalism with which we can engage in our discussions. So a very big thank you to you all. I want to just finish really with a vote of thanks to Bristol Ideas, to our colleagues there, Andrew, Zoe and Amy in particular, and my team at the University of Bath, to Sophie in particular, and Amy for their work on this conference, getting up and running, to Jeff Crocker, who you heard earlier, gave a great summary of the day, a great partner to us. So thank you very much indeed to all of those. It's been really, really good to be able to put this on, and they've all played a huge part in making it happen. If you want to rewatch any of the sessions, you'll be able to do so via the same links that you've used today. And I really hope that you remain engaged with us at the Institute for Policy Research and Bristol Ideas. I know there's a lot coming up. Bristol Ideas have got the Festival of Economics coming up, the Festival of the Future City, and we at IPR have got a new series on the future of our oceans, a deep dive into the climate change that's affecting the oceans, the geopolitics of oceanographic conflict, as well as some of the major questions about how we steward and manage oceanic resources in the future. So a big conference season coming up for us too. And we, of course, continue all of our detailed research work on basic income, got a big new program on the economics of basic income, and we've got a lot of work on universal credit, which we're shortly to publish as well. So please do keep an eye out for all of that. And next week, I'll just finish with this. Next week, also the national conference, annual conference of the Freiburg Institute of Basic Income Studies. You heard Bernard Neumacher earlier speaking from Freiburg. Big conference next week, so do have a look at that, the Fribis website. I'll be doing a session with Ollie Kangas, who designed and implemented and evaluated the basic income pilot in Finland. So thanks again. As I say, do keep in touch. Enjoy your evenings, your afternoons, wherever you are around the world, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much indeed.